My name is Sarah Cook, and I'm the Director of the Institute for Global Development at UNSW, and I'm here with my colleague, Somali Cerise, who leads the IGD project on gender and just transitions. As part of this project, the IGD recently hosted a fantastic and diverse group of experts from around the world to discuss feminist approaches to a just transition. In a stimulating conversation, a number of key ideas emerged. Participants drew attention to the need to redefine the relationship between humans and the environment, and to rethink what we value, including critiquing the continued use of GDP as the measure of progress. They highlighted the importance of a more expansive definition of justice that would include key elements of gender justice, such as redistribution of power and resources, addressing inequalities, and enabling participation of all. And they proposed an ethics of care approach to guide a just transition, one that centers on the care for people and planet as interlinked objectives that enable all people and the natural world to flourish. And we are absolutely delighted now to have the opportunity to talk further with one of the participants, Dr. Sarah Gammage, and to explore some of her contributions in more depth. Sarah is an environmental economist and is currently Director of Policy and Government Relations with the Nature Conservancy. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us today. So Sarah, at the workshop, you raised a really important point concerning reconfiguring the economy around social and environmental provisioning. Could you explain a little bit more what these concepts mean to you and why you think they're important for a gender just transition?
Sure, thank you. Well, this draws very much on Marilyn Power's work and her article in Feminist Economics from 2004, the idea of social provisioning as a starting point for feminist economics. And I think what really is so powerful about this work is that it brought together a lot of thinking about how we place care at the center of our analysis and our policy work and our advocacy. And she uses this term social provisioning to describe an approach to understanding welfare and well-being. And she advanced 5 components, which are really very compelling about what would make a social provisioning approach. And the first one was that caring labor was incorporated into that analysis ex ante, right? And the second one was that human well-being was a central measure of economic success. The third was that human agency is important. The fourth was that ethical judgments are valid. And I think this is really, really important when we think about how we make claims on duty bearers, how we ask for policy. Ethical judgments are key here. And finally, that an intersectional analysis is important. So she saw social provisioning as something that explained, that advanced, that called for economic activity, that saw the ways that people organize themselves collectively for social provisioning. And I think environmental provisioning can have a similar approach. It's sort of very similar to the invisible role of unpaid care in sustaining well-being and economic and social reproduction. The environment renders critical services and has existential and innate value in the same way. And the environment encapsulates what is a global public good. It's essential for our survival. And it has its own deep existential value itself. But what we know is that the way we've organized production, consumption, and distribution, markets consistently fail to price and allocate ecosystem goods and services. We've got externalities, pollution goes unabated, waste is discharged, the rights to extract are conferred without any true understanding of the costs, and unequally. And as a result, we are plundering nature and undermining ecosystem integrity and its resilience. So I see a real parallel with the social provisioning argument, that we could have an environmental provisioning argument, and that environmental services would be incorporated into our analysis of economic well-being ex ante, and that we would have a notion of environmental and ecosystem resilience and recovery as a central measure of success. And so this is about bringing those two arguments together and seeing, what do we learn when we bring these two sets of arguments together. But I also want to say, you know, I'm very much a feminist economist, and I think it's also about a feminist argument. And what I love about watching the sort of discourse evolve around what is a feminist argument is that it centers on some really powerful ideas around deconstructing the familiar, making visible the invisible, and considering the relational and power dynamics, and going beyond the binary and challenging utilitarian visions and answers and surfacing communitarian. So I think this is something that's really powerful. It validates ethical argumentation. It goes beyond money metrics of valuation. It embraces a bigger understanding of human welfare and well-being. It fosters agency, and it considers substantive freedoms. And here I would put substantive freedoms for people and nature. So at the end of the day, I'm hoping that if we evolve this understanding of what a just transition looks like, that we'd be talking about programs and policies that integrate both environmental and social provisioning. And they don't contemplate valuing one at the expense of the other. We need approaches that are more symbiotic, more mutualistic.
Thanks, Sarah. I think you so beautifully drew out the parallels between, those 5 elements of social provisioning and then, what that might look like for environmental provisioning. I'm just wondering if you could expand a bit further and share your reflections on, what it would look like in policy terms, particularly the, the symbiotic relationship that you described.
Absolutely. So I was just sort of thinking through, let's consider the idea, the way we've been valorizing unpaid care and environmental goods and services. And the goal is to get better social and environmental policy that fundamentally enhances welfare and well-being. So just thinking this through, focusing on time burdens, we know from what we've done before, from the way we've approached it, that valuing time, surfacing the role that time and time use and unpaid care plays has really helped us understand how better to address the challenges of social reproduction, but also to enhance welfare and well-being. So we think that correct valuation leads to better economic policy, but I don't mean this sort of narrow monetary value, narrowly calibrating the value of something, arguing over the methodology, which way to do it, but actually valorizing it as important and existential. And I think that, we have an opportunity here to think about how we do that. Let's consider regenerative agriculture, changing the way we produce so that we value ecosystem services. Through this approach, we can fix carbon, restore ecosystem health, protect biodiversity, ensure that production occurs without damaging ecosystems. But some of the practices in this bucket of regenerative agriculture are actually quite time intensive. And program and project planners and policymakers can assume that all the time of the people engaged, and particularly the time of the poor, is fungible. So no-tilling practices reduce carbon released from soils and increased moisture retention, but they can actually increase weeding responsibilities. And weeding responsibilities are typically gendered and often assigned to women and children in many rural economies and subsistence households. So if these regenerative practices are introduced without taking account of unpaid labor and existing time burdens, they can potentially increase women and children's time burdens and undermine the right to care, reducing the opportunities for meaningful social reproduction. So then that transition is unjust and unfair. So I think, we can start by using these concepts to really tease it apart. The reverse is a little harder to construct and probably seen less frequently, but you can imagine a policy that was built on valuing women's time and trying to reduce time burdens in rural areas where we know that women and children spend a lot of time hauling water and gathering fuel wood. So perhaps you choose to pipe water into communities to reduce time burdens. But if you do that at the expense of mining aquifers and reducing the water table and eventually producing saltwater intrusion, then you've got a conflict that isn't resolved carefully. So a social and environmental provisioning approach would ensure that we don't undervalue either form of provisioning, and we start to secure better outcomes for people and nature simultaneously.
Thank you, Sarah. I love the way you've, brought out the, the tensions and the trade-offs and the ways that we might be able to think about overcoming those when we think about both policies that are both social and environmental. The COVID pandemic has brought into sharp relief the issues of care and the environment, and the ways in which the dominant economic models have historically invisibilised, devalued and exploited both the natural environment and women's labour. And you touched on that earlier in your comments, particularly care labour. I think we've got quite a unique opportunity now to change some of the thinking around this. So I'm wondering if you could share your reflections on how we use this opportunity to bring on board a broader and more diverse range of actors to support the kinds of policy change that you've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think for me, what was so powerful about the discussions you had was it really made us focus on what does a just transition look like and how do we articulate it, and then who has to be on board. And I think our production and distribution systems would value and guarantee the right to care and be cared for, and the right to environmental services and the integrity of ecosystems for both people and nature. So we've clearly got to redesign our production, distribution, and social protection systems so that they don't immiserize, but they dignify, so that they're not extractive, but they are regenerative. And, going back to food systems, we need food systems that are inclusive and equitable, that secure adequate nutrition, that are achieved without undermining ecosystem services. And regenerative agriculture holds a lot of promise to do this, fixing carbons in crops and soils, reducing erosion, retaining moisture. And conventional agricultural practices in this quest for higher yields and more production have damaged the natural capital on which agricultural success depends, jeopardizing its ecosystems and potential to continue contributing to global food production. We know that climate change is drastically affecting many of our region's food systems, habitats and biomes. Higher temperatures, we have more variable rains, prolonged droughts, floods, hurricanes, fires. They're changing the way people farm and the food systems they rely on. So we need to get all of these actors just in this particular value chain, just in food production. We need to get all of these actors together. And we need systemic changes to alter the incentives to degrade for all actors. So that means governments. Governments have to be involved. They're regulating, they're defining the incentives, they're applying sanctions, they're ensuring that we don't violate collective commitments. The private sector has to be involved because we're not going to upend markets entirely in this process. They're going to continue to be a primary mechanism through which we produce, consume, distribute, and communities that are affected, communities that produce. So we need to bring everyone together, and we need to change just in the food systems, we need to change agricultural practices to do this well. We need to increase livestock rates, develop silvopastoral systems that add in trees, manage pasture. We need agroecology. We need all of these things to maximize soil nutrients and ensure that as we produce the food that we need to sustain ourselves, we're not undermining ecosystems. So that means a massive redesign also of our subsidies. We currently provide subsidies that create these perverse incentives to degrade and to use chemicals that are polluting our waterways and polluting our entire ecosystems, killing biodiversity. We're engaging in monocropping, extensive monocropping. So we need to begin to develop the right incentives to remove perverse incentives, to really organize production and consumption in an entirely different way. And we're going to need transparency and traceability so that we can choose not to consume products that degrade the environment or the people that work in these food systems and supply chains. So we need collective agreements that support trade and markets that are regenerative and ensure decent work. We need sanctions that bind for those that violate these collective agreements, and support for transitioning into regenerative practices. So my feeling is that we need to look deeper into the COVID recovery efforts. So let's look at the initiatives like Vivid Economics. They've done an incredible job of looking at which of the stimulus packages, the recovery packages, are greener and more sustainable. So why don't we add in that and look which ones value decent work and the right to care and be cared for? Let's see if we're getting any of these sort of social provisioning and environmental provisioning criteria embedded in, baked into our recovery packages. And let's make this part of our policy and programmatic discussions with governments about fulfilling the 2030 agenda at the CBD, at the climate COP. And as we lobby with our governments and lobby the UN and engage the UN, we're going to have to bring vast groups of people along, consumer groups, producers, cooperatives, governments. We have a lot of work to do and a lot of people to engage.
Thanks, Sarah. I absolutely love your idea of actually analysing the COVID stimulus responses and looking at not only, those that are green and sustainable, but also looking at the, social dimensions and the synergies between the two. Thank you so much. You've shared some rich and powerful insights. I'm feeling energised and inspired by everything you've shared. We know that this is just the start of the conversation, and we look forward to continuing this with you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure.
And my thanks also, Sarah, for really fabulous insights, which I think help us to draw together both the social and the environmental provisioning, but also took us from sort of some very theoretical discussions, conceptual discussions, down really to some very detailed and pragmatic examples and the challenges of things that can help us move forward. My thanks also to Somali for working with us on this. And we really hope that everybody who's listening or who will listen will enjoy this interview, this conversation, and will also tune into the others that will shortly follow. Thank you.